Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today, we've got a fascinating discussion ahead for you. I am here with Joshua Green. Joshua Green is a journalist and an author. He's written for Bloomberg, he's written for the Boston Globe, my hometown paper, and he's written for The Atlantic. He is the author of a new book called The Rebels, which focuses on the progressive left of the Democratic Party, especially three figures, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We talk so much about the populist wing of the Republican Party. It's really worth taking a look at the populist wing of the Democratic Party, which, although maybe it hasn't had as obvious an impact, on the surface, it's probably had at least as important an impact on the policy of the Democratic Party. Josh, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So, Josh, your last book was called The Devil's Bargain. It was about Steve Bannon and his relationship with Donald Trump. And I remember when this book came out because it was kind of inescapable. I saw the cover everywhere. I was living in Abu Dhabi at the time, as I did throughout really the Donald Trump presidency, but I still saw this book cover in bookstores across Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And Josh, I think it's interesting that you have kind of profiled the populist intellectual leaders of both the Democratic left and the Republican right. But at the same time, I imagine that the process of researching these people must have been quite different because Steve Bannon, although he play acts as this hostile anti-media warrior, he's also known for being one of the most accessible figures to the media. He's known for welcoming any kind of profile and spending lots of time and giving lots of access to journalists. I don't know if that's really the case with these three figures that you've profiled, especially Sanders, who's got kind of a crotchety reputation. So what were the similarities and differences to covering Bannon and then this group?
Well, it was weird. I mean, I kind of fell into the Bannon thing accidentally. I'd gotten to know him in like the early 2010s, like kind of rise of the Tea Party type stuff, where I'd written a big profile of Sarah Palin in The Atlantic. And at the time, Bannon was kind of a Palin whisperer. And it kind of reached out and I'd gotten to know this weird, colorful figure and followed him around for a couple of years. Like you said, loved to talk to reporters, was completely anonymous back then. And I profiled him in 2015 because he had what I thought was a really interesting plan to kind of tear down Hillary Clinton, who it was pretty clear was going to be the Democratic nominee in 2016. And it just so happened that after I wrote that Business Week cover story, he wound up kind of emerging as the chairman of Breitbart News and eventually running Donald Trump's campaign. And so even though my interests have always been on the political left, Bannon and Trump getting elected was a much more interesting story in 2016. And so my last book was on the rise of the populist right. I think the difference this time around is twofold. I've known Warren for a long time, and she's very good about access. Sanders was too, to be frank, especially once he was running for president. AOC a little bit less so, but this is really kind of the flip side of that book. To me, it's sort of the flip side of the same story, and that is the enormous backlash in American politics that followed the financial crisis. At first, that backlash was mainly directed at banks. Later on, it was directed at government officials too. By 2016, it was pretty much directed at like any figure of authority. And I think that's kind of carried on to today. So what interested me was that even back when I was writing the last book, I was still spending a lot of time on the campaign trail and in Washington with Sanders, with Bernie. AOC had not yet arrived. And to me, like what they were doing was every bit as revolutionary as what Steve Bannon and Donald Trump were doing in terms of kind of changing the cast of the Democratic Party. But because they weren't quite similarly inflammatory figures, and because only Bernie was running for president, they didn't create sort of the same amount of like public alarm and attention that my first characters did. But this book was really an effort to kind of go back and tell the Democratic story from the very beginning, not just the presidential campaigns, but the deep history of how it was that this populist wing of the Democratic Party first arose.
You know, it's interesting, Josh, that you point to the 2008 financial crisis as kind of the genesis of this new wave of populism, because it explains both the left and the right. And in some ways, both the populist movements on the left and the right are focused on some of the same things when you look at it through the lens of 2008. The idea that the system is rigged, that the billionaires are taking advantage of the working man, that the government were way too cozy with Wall Street in that period. that's sort of the origin story of Bannon, and also of at least one of the figures that you're focused on here. And I think in particular, that's Elizabeth Warren. She was already an academic. She had written some acclaimed books, but she wasn't really known as a political figure until after 2008. And she emerges in 2008 as really a critic of Obama and especially the Treasury Secretary under Obama, Tim Geithner. So were the initial fans that Elizabeth Warren was cultivating at that time, did they cross over what we now think of as the left-right divide inside of populism? Did she have a lot of kind of right-wing Bannon-esque fans when she first kind of came on the stage? And was it even inevitable that she was going to become a fixture of the Democratic Party?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that it was inevitable, but it certainly was striking. And I had a really interesting and unusual perch to watch this unfold in 2009. Back then, my day job was a political magazine writer for The Atlantic, which back then was The Atlantic Monthly. And I spent the first 6 months of the Obama administration embedded with Tim Geithner for a big profile that I was doing. So during the day, I would be hanging around the Treasury, getting Geithner's view of the crisis and how to attack it from kind of a Wall Street standpoint. I was also a freelance columnist for the Boston Globe's editorial page. And I got to know Warren, who was a kind of a behind the scenes advisor to some Senate Democrats, Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid in particular. She had some academic renown as a Harvard law professor. She'd written the book, The Two Income Trap, that was sort of the academic basis, I think, for a lot of the democratic populism that came about as a result. But it struck me even at the time, she had a completely different view of the crisis. I would spend the day with Geithner listening to how and why he was going to bail out the banks, why he thought that was the best way for the American middle class to recover. And then after work, I would talk to Elizabeth Warren, and she would be criticizing Geithner and saying, no, there's a kind of a different way to go after this that doesn't go through Wall Street banks. And you can basically see that cleavage sort of play out for the next 15 years of Democratic politics. So to me, initially with Warren, I think that there was a lot of political overlap because I think the two parties weren't quite as polarized in the immediate wake of the financial crash. And also, I think that there was just broad bipartisan kind of normie antipathy to both the Democratic and Wall Street establishments. The Bush administration was in office when Lehman Brothers fell apart, and then Obama oversaw a lot of the subsequent recovery, dissatisfying as it was to so many people. And so, if you looked at like a Gallup poll in 2009, Gallup always asked people like, what's the most important problem facing the economy today or facing America today? It was the economy and it was banks. And that was true like across Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So there is a lot of overlap. And even today, when we're super polarized and you're either on team red or team blue, there are still areas of overlap when it comes to economic populism. It was no accident that Biden decided to keep Trump's China tariffs in place. And it's no accident that, when Bannon rails against Wall Street, he often sounds as if he's echoing Elizabeth Warren. So when you get to the populist left and the populist right, there are certainly areas of policy overlap.
Yeah, I wonder if Steve Bannon is the only critic of Wall Street who is a former executive at Goldman Sachs. And I wonder if he's also the only critic of Hollywood who gets residual checks from reruns of Seinfeld.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, this idea of the kind of cross-pollination ideologically is pretty interesting. I remember in the last election cycle, Tucker Carlson was saying that he was a big admirer of the two-income trap, and he would vote for Elizabeth Warren for president if he had the chance. And a lot of that maybe is just posturing. I think that the Republicans love Democrats that criticize other Democrats and love to highlight them in the same way that Democrats love never Trump Republicans. So Elizabeth Warren's position as this critic of Obama and Geithner maybe was appealing to people like Carlson and Bannon simply because it was a divide and conquer opportunity. Do you think that Bannon and Carlson and people like that are sincere in their admiration of some of these ideas?
I actually do give him a little bit more credit than that. Hard to believe Tucker Carlson ever voting for Elizabeth Warren. But, if you look at the worldview of populist kind of entertainer slash political figures like Bannon, like Tucker Carlson, there is a pretty clear thread of anti-elite, anti-globalist, anti-banker thread. But it is something that animates both populist bases. I mean, one of the things that stood out to me out on the campaign trail in 2016 was that, I would go to a Trump rally. Trump was still brand new then, and I would always ask people, well, who's your second choice after Trump? And very often it wasn't a Republican; it was Bernie Sanders. And when I would go to Sanders rallies, less so on like college campuses, but if you're in a small town in Iowa, and you ask somebody who's your second choice, a lot of times, especially if a middle-aged blue collar worker, the answer would be Donald Trump. And I think that's because they do perceive that there is a kind of, at least rhetorically, Trump never really backed it up with policy. But rhetorically, they do echo each other when it comes to kind of anti-Wall Street, anti-elite sentiment, and on the idea that the middle class is getting screwed. Now, obviously, where they differ is Warren, Sanders, and AOC with like a much more robust, social policy than any Republican would. But again, like when it comes to things like tariffs, I think it's interesting that the Democratic administration has kept some of the things that quietly kept some of the things that Trump put in place, and I think that shows that for all the enormous differences between the two parties, there are still small places where they overlap in terms of policy.
So when I took office, I was determined to rebuild this economy based on what this country's always done best. Not just buying and consuming, but building, making things, selling those goods all around the world, stamped with three proud words: made in America. And that's why one of the first decisions that I made as president was to save the U.S. auto industry from collapse. There were a lot of politicians who said it wasn't worth the time and wasn't worth the money. In fact, there's some politicians who still say that. Well, they should come tell that to the workers here at Orient.
I think that the historical narrative that's been promoted by Warren, Bannon, Tucker Carlson has sort of crystallized. They sort of won the historic narrative building argument, where we do look back at the Obama presidency and we say, okay, this was a presidency that was quite close to Wall Street, that ignored some of the economic malaise of middle America, deindustrialization, and all of that, and allowed space for this populist backlash. But it's kind of funny looking back on the 2012 election cycle, and you see that Obama actually did himself adopt some of these economic populist themes. The auto bailout was a huge feature of his re-election campaign, and a big contrast that he made with Mitt Romney. They were already talking about how deindustrialization was this risk to the American way of life that needed to be stemmed. There was all this talk about billionaires not paying their fair share, that they didn't have the respect and deference to billionaires that Romney had. There was a lot of talk about how they were committed to social welfare programs that the Republicans were threatening. There were already these economic populist themes. Do you see some continuity with the Obama years, or do you really think that what Sanders, Warren, and Ocasio represent is a hard break from that period of the Democratic Party history?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I covered that campaign when Obama was running for re-election, and rhetorically, he struck many of those same notes. I mean, he gave his sort of landmark speech in that campaign was delivered in, I'm going to screw up the name, Ottawa, Kansas, where FDR had given a similarly kind of populist speech in the 1940s. I think the reason, in speaking to David Axelrod and people in that campaigns, one of the reasons that Obama emphasized those themes was, one, the economy was still in really bad shape. Unemployment was high. The jobs hadn't recovered, in part because of the weakness of the recovery package. But the main thing by far was that, their opponent, Mitt Romney, was almost like a kind of a cartoon villain of a Wall Street plutocrat. And it was very easy and politically advantageous for Obama to talk about him as this rapacious vulture capitalist. That was the term back then, in part because Romney had already been branded as such by his own party. Newt Gingrich had kind of gone after him, Rick Perry. The idea that he was this sort of like, Richie rich guy, bleeding these Midwestern industrial companies dry and impoverishing their workers. And in fairness, there was some truth to that. The reason I don't really put Obama as a key figure in this populist uprising is that it really was rhetorical. I mean, once he had beaten Mitt Romney, Obama did not, roll out a wealth tax on millionaires and billionaires and do really any of the things that my three characters did. And in fact, one of the things Obama did do was try and strike a grand bargain with John Boehner that would have cut things like Social Security that were completely against what an Elizabeth Warren, for instance, would have wanted and fought against at the time. And ultimately, that effort failed. But I think you can see Obama's, I guess we would now call it like a neoliberal instinct in pushing for things like deficit reduction, tighter budgets, rather than having a kind of robust social democratic policy agenda along the lines of what a Bernie Sanders or somebody like that would want.
So I suppose maybe this is an unusual or uncommon comparison, but in that sense, maybe Obama is a little bit like Donald Trump when it comes to economic populism, where it's in the rhetoric, but it's not in the policy.
I don't know if I want to touch that one, but yeah.
I mean, there's a few points of comparison. I mean, they both have that star power that everyone always talks about too. But I mean, when it comes to this economic populism that we're focused on kind of in this discussion, your two recent books, maybe there is a comparison where it's a lot of rhetoric, maybe not so much on policy. But the difference is that we somehow still give Trump credit as a genuine populist, and we don't do the same for Obama.
I had never thought about it in those terms, but I do think that I do think that you have a point there. The thing that stands out to me, or one thing that sort of stands out to me, is back in 2017, when my book had just come out. And Steve Bannon was still in the White House. He was Trump's, I forget, chief strategist or whatever his inflated title was. I was like, the only way I could get time with him was early on Saturday mornings. I would go to Dunkin' Donuts and I would buy a box of like a dozen donuts, and I would drive to his house on Capitol Hill at like 7 a.m. Bannon keeps like vampire hours. And we would sit there and talk, and he would just sort of ramble and discourse about his populist visions. And the two things that kind of consumed him there were, one, he'd had this idea, which was pretty novel, that he wanted Trump to get behind a tax increase, a very tiny, tiny tax increase on people who made more than $5 million a year. And, symbolically, I think it would have been very powerful. Bannon believed that it would deflate all the liberal criticism of Republicans as the party of the rich, and allow Trump to kind of really, really claim the populist mantle that he run on. It got nowhere. Everybody else in the administration like leaked on him, and it got stabbed in the back and embarrassed. But the other thing that he used to fixate on during those donut talks in the morning was his big fear was that if Trump didn't act on this economic populism, he would be ceding the idea to people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Warren was the one he really feared back then. And in a weird kind of way, the genesis of the rebels kind of came from Steve Bannon, because I'm like, well, explain what you're talking about. And he said, our real weakness, meaning us as Republicans or MAGA Republicans, would be the emergence of like a patriotic democratic nationalism. That's what he called it, built around protecting the middle class, tariffs to protect industrial jobs, going after China, big infrastructure plan, all the stuff Trump promised but wasn't able to deliver. And so that always sort of lodged in my mind that, you can run on this stuff, and certainly populism has a lot of rhetorical power if you're a politician. But if you don't follow through on it, eventually the other team might decide to and steal away some of your voters. And I think that's part of what Joe Biden was able to accomplish in 2020, was to pull back enough of those Trump voters that he prevented Trump from getting a second term.
Also, Josh, I think that your book might have played a role in ceding this ground to the Democrats because it might have helped get Steve Bannon fired. I remember, I remember at the time,
I think so. I think
Trump
so.
was so upset that his sidekick was upstaging him, that he was on the cover of your book, that he was on the cover of Time magazine, and it was all about how he was the puppet master. And Trump said, "No, I'd rather my son be the puppet master and not." And
Yeah, well, he sent a very Trump put out a very angry tweet to that effect about how my book was fake news or whatever, that I'm sure helped like sell hundreds if not thousands of copies. So I appreciated that very much. But yeah, I think it did. I think it did help to cut short the political career of Steve Bannon in the Trump White
well,
House.
we'll see if we can get Trump to call the rebels fake news. But Bannon was afraid that Elizabeth Warren could be the person to take this space that he wanted to occupy. And it's kind of funny because Trump ran in that 2016 election cycle that people thought Warren might run it and did not think Trump was going to run it. And so I wanted to hear from Josh about how close you think Warren actually came to running in that cycle. And I'm also interested in the counterfactual because if Warren ran, I wonder what would have happened with the Sanders campaign if there would have been the opportunity for him to become this household name. He'd been in politics in New England for decades. I was very familiar with him as a New Englander, but he was a very marginal figure on the national stage. And because there was no one else running against Hillary Clinton, he managed to build a huge name for himself. And I wonder if maybe that doesn't happen if Elizabeth Warren decides to take the leap and run in that cycle.
I'm glad you brought all that up because this whole history is all in the rebels. Because I was especially close to kind of Warren and her staff at the time, and there was a lot of debate internally in 2013, 2014. People, if you didn't live through that era of politics, or if you weren't kind of paying close attention, people forget what a superstar Elizabeth Warren was at the time. She'd emerged as this figure, not just in politics, but kind of in the broader popular culture. Jon Stewart on The Daily Show was a big fan, and journalists would talk about like the Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party. And there really was a lot of pressure and expectation that she would run for president in 2016. There were definitely people on her staff who wanted her to, but I don't think Warren ever really had any ambitions to be president herself. And so, despite the fact that there were two draft movements for Warren, Run, Warren, Run, and I forgot what the other one was, Ready for Warren, the last minute she decided she wasn't going to run. And literally those draft movements sort of like flipped the sign out front and became, Run, Bernie, Run. And, if Warren had decided to run, I don't think Bernie Sanders would have gotten into the race. I don't think that he would have emerged as the, iconic figure that he did because of her absence. But I also think it's kind of fun to think about what would have happened if Warren had run in 2016. Because the debate we used to have kind of internally, me and some of her top staffers, was if she runs, she has a very clear and popular agenda that's particularly clear with Democratic primary voters. This brand of economic populism. At the time, banks were still very much the bad guys. The country was very much in the grip still of the austerity and kind of agonizingly slow recovery from the 2008 crash. And Warren was very, very popular, which Hillary Clinton really was not. So I thought there were two options. One is Warren might actually beat Clinton and become the nominee. And boy, would that have been fascinating, an Elizabeth Warren versus a Donald Trump. I don't know how you would have handicapped that one. I think the more likely scenario was that she would have challenged Clinton and probably lost. But because Clinton didn't really have any kind of a clear ideological agenda when she ran, it was just sort of, it's her turn. I think if Warren had done well in the primaries, Clinton basically would have taken up her economic agenda in order to kind of co-opt it and beat her in the Democratic primary. And a Hillary Clinton that was running on more of a populist economic message, I think would have been a much stronger candidate against Donald Trump. There was some talk, I get into this story in the book too, about Clinton even adding Warren as her vice president, so adding to the ticket. Either one of those scenarios, to me, would have presented a fascinating counterfactual of a Democrat running on economic policy against Donald Trump. The race was only decided by, I forget what it was, 80, 90,000 votes across a couple of states. had that happened, we might never have had a Donald Trump. And certainly if Trump lost that first race, I think he would have disappeared from the political scene. So who knows what the world might have looked like if Warren had heeded the draft call, but she didn't. And so, here we are today.
It's interesting, Josh, that you say that Warren didn't want to run for president, didn't want to be president, because it makes her so different from people like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, who wake up every day, look in the mirror, and imagine themselves as president for decades. Warren didn't even want to be a senator. She wanted to run the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and work in kind of this bureaucratic, wonky space. And it was only when that fell through that she got into electoral politics in the first place. So she's a more modest person than maybe we often see in competitive politics. But also, people of that nature don't tend to end up getting elected because it takes this sort of superhuman ego to think that you're the right person to tackle all of the problems that the presidency requires, and that you have the charisma to rally the masses to your cause.
Right. And like the gross example of that is Ted Cruz, who's been, running for president since he came out of the womb. No, I think a big part, I think it cut both ways for Warren. A big part of her initial appeal was that she looked and sounded nothing like a politician. She looked like a Sunday school teacher with her little bob haircut and her cardigan sweaters. And one reason why Democrats were so afraid of her before she became a politician was that she didn't seem to want anything in particular other than to sort of tell the truth and help middle class people get a fair shake. I remember talking to Barney Frank, I think this is in the book, who said, she's the Democrat, she's the most powerful Democrat. Everybody is frightened of her. But the minute she runs for president, that magical aura will shatter because then she's just another presidential candidate kind of looking to get to the White House. And I remember being struck by that because Barney Frank, the Massachusetts congressman, was both a friend and an ally of Elizabeth Warren's. But Frank is known for straight talk. And I think that was pretty much borne out. Warren's, as you said, Warren's original desire had been to run the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that she dreamed up. But she was such a controversial figure by 2011 that Obama didn't want to appoint her, didn't think she could pass Senate muster. And so lacking that avenue, she decided to run for Massachusetts senator, and the rest is history.
I suppose this background also makes her very different from that other figure that we often compare her to, including on the cover of the book, Senator Sanders, because we're talking about her ambitions to run aspects of the bureaucracy, her career in academia, being really in the details of economic policy, in particular banking policy, which was her area of specialty at Harvard Law School. And that makes her quite a different person from Sanders, doesn't it? Because at the time that she's sort of in the details and researching and looking into the mechanisms of the economy, he's talking about BlackRock and Vanguard, and it's almost conspiracy theory adjacent sort of populist soapbox, Hyde Park Speaker's Corner sort of stuff from him, right? So we compare them, but they are really quite different people, aren't they? In the way that they approach these problems, even if they come from a similar instinct.
Yeah, what's interesting is I think, in terms of the policies that they'd like to see enacted, there's probably a lot of overlap there, but they couldn't be any more different in background and style. Warren had come from Oklahoma and had been a Republican until fairly late in life, and was, of course, a nerdy academic. Sanders, Democratic socialist, had been running for office, local office, Vermont statewide office, and had the same politics from like the moment he appeared on the scene, and was this kind of crusty, curmudgeonly, the Bernie that we all know and are familiar with. He was the same guy 30, 40 years ago. So yeah, they really do have completely different backgrounds, and yet really kind of wound up in the same lane in Democratic politics. And I think the fact that they did was one of the reasons why both of them had trouble making headway in the 2020 Democratic primaries. They were too similar. They were appealing to similar blocks of voters, and so neither one of them was going to progress unless the other one dropped out.
Growing up in New England, I feel like I know the Sanders base really well because there's a certain type of person, especially in New England, also upstate New York. They go to Phish concerts that maybe enjoy partaking in recreational drug use, that really glamorize the sort of Woodstock era Vietnam War protest aesthetic. And that's sort of the Bernie Sanders voter that, and has been since the 1990s. And this was a big part of the Democratic Party during the Bush years, Michael Moore, that kind of anti-Iraq war protest movement. But it's also a lot of people who don't believe in vaccine science, maybe who watch a lot of YouTube documentaries that give weird ideas about the Illuminati, that are voting for Bobby Kennedy Jr. or are intending to. We talk about the lanes in the Democratic Party, and there's an alternative theory about this. We know that Sanders and Warren are advocating for a lot of the same things, but they're culturally different for all the reasons we're talking about. And just like you said, Josh, that makes Sanders supporters willing to change between him and Trump. So there's this different theory that it's about the beer track and the wine track, the blue collars and the white collars, and that Sanders and Warren's supporters are quite different, not interchangeable. What do you think about that? Are we organizing all of this wrong because so much of it is aesthetic and cultural?
I don't know. I mean, I think if you go back to 2015, 2016, the thrust of the message from Sanders and from Warren was very much geared around economic populism, anti-Wall Street. The notes they struck were very similar. The types of people that appealed to were very similar. There's always the kind of far left fringe on the Democratic Party. I've been around long enough that I covered these people when they were behind Dennis Kucinich in the Peace Party. There's always an element that's going to vote for the furthest left candidate and is especially attracted to sort of the aesthetics of Bernie Sanders, the kind of lovable rumper curmudgeon who isn't polished and won't play ball with the party in the way that I think Warren was more willing to do. But I don't think that there was a huge difference between Warren and Sanders in 2015, 2016. Certainly, you could jump in and say, well, she was a Democrat, he wasn't. But in terms of the void that they filled in the Democratic Party, there had not been someone in recent years in Democratic politics who was a true economic populist. As we mentioned earlier, Obama rhetorically had struck some of these same notes in 2012, but there wasn't a Democratic presidential primary then, so he wasn't really running against anybody but a Republican private equity executive. I think for Warren and Sanders in 2016, they were really filling a void that we didn't know existed yet. I think Warren could have filled that void if she'd chosen to run. But when Bernie did, and I sort of get into this history in the piece, Bernie had been around Washington for years. I mean, I knew him. Everybody knew him. He was often like kind of the lone vote on some bill in Congress. But he wasn't the kind of lovable curmudgeon meme figure that he became. Like that happened in the span of literally a month. He came out and announced his presidential campaign on the lawn in front of Congress to, no supporters there, just a handful of reporters. And within a month, his message had caught fire and he was filling stadiums and doing things that like nobody in a million years would have expected, including Sanders and his staff. I mean, I think part of the subtle comedy in the book was talking to them about, when they realized that something bigger was going on here, that, this no hoper campaign that they thought they'd be joining suddenly was, filling arenas across the country, and Bernie was kind of the hottest candidate in the world. So clearly there was, a message that Democrats or the Democratic politicians had not been conveying to people, that once it was delivered by Bernie Sanders in 2015 and 2016, I think activated this giant uprising that you've seen that's become now a real pillar of the Democratic Party. We're not going to go back to a kind of pro-Wall Street unanimity or a neoliberal party in the way that we had in the 1990s and 2000s under Bill Clinton. My three characters, I think Bernie in particular, based on the strength of that presidential run, has really changed what it means to be a Democrat and what the party stands for. There's enough of a constituency that cares about these things that it isn't going to go back to the way it was. The challenge instead is going to be, how does somebody with this worldview capture the White House? Can they capture the White House?
Yeah, I suppose he could not have gone into the two elections that he ran in with any more different of a mindset, could he? I mean, entering that 2016 race with his thought in mind that he's a gadfly who's maybe going to push Clinton a little bit to the left and get a few percentages of the vote in New Hampshire and drop out. And then in 2020, when he entered the race, really, I think, thinking that he was going to be the nominee, that it was his time. And I think that really demonstrates just what you've said, Josh, the change that seemed to happen inside the Democratic Party just in the 4 short years since he ran the first time, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, there's a scene in the book where Bernie is, in 2015, is annoying his advisors because he's sort of hamleting between, well, do I run? Do I not run? Do I get in? Do I not get in? And they finally have a meeting at one of his staffers' apartments. And he says, well, I'm going to get in the race. And my goal is to, change the message, of what's talked about in the Democratic primaries. If I'm in there, we're going to talk about economic populism. Because Warren's not running, if I don't run, that's probably a note that is not going to be struck. And so I'm going to get in with the hope simply of helping steer the conversation. And, by that measure, he succeeded beyond anybody's wildest dreams. I mean, he eventually wound up winning, I think, 23 states. He wound up raising and spending more money than Clinton herself did. And while he obviously fell short of winning the nomination, he became a major figure in the party, and he sort of like inaugurated I guess you could now call it the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. But it's the same place policy wise where I think Elizabeth Warren is, where AOC and a lot of the members of the squad are, and where frankly Biden himself has shifted over to as president. If you look at some of the things he's passed, the multiple rounds of stimulus, the Inflation Reduction Act was a giant $300 billion climate bill in disguise. Even Biden himself came out for a billionaire's tax in last year's State of the Union address, which nobody remembers. But to see the distance that Biden has traveled as a politician from who he was as a Democratic senator in, say, the early 2000s to how he now governs as president in 2024 is just to see the giant shift that these populist Democrats have created in the party over the last 15 years.
I said it then, and I'll keep saying it. With this law, the American people won and special interests lost. Say it again. The American people won and special interests lost. Environmental activists, students, and young people, advocates for senior citizens and families. This is what it looks like when the American government works for the people. When we tell the powerful interests, no, you're not going to get your way. This time, not this year, not this time, not now. Let's be honest. Passing this law wasn't easy. I proposed as soon as I got here, basically. And I've said that day that I was determined to work with Republicans.
So, Josh, you're talking about how these populist Democrats have succeeded really in pushing Biden to the left. They have had a lot of success at getting him to adopt policies that they advocated for, and also how Biden has had a lot of success at getting these policies into law. I mean, he's so skillfully navigated this 50-50 Senate, and his relationships with moderates in the Democratic Party and his kind of perception as himself being a moderate has been an incredible asset for him in getting these policies over the line. And it seems as though a lot of young progressive activists don't realize this and maybe haven't given Biden the credit that you might expect them to for these achievements. But what about the trio that you're profiling in the book, Sanders, Warren, and Ocasio? Do they recognize that Biden has achieved a lot for their movement? What's their perspective on Biden's presidency?
That's a great question, and I wrestle with this a little bit at the very end of the book. To me, one of the really surprising things about Biden's presidency has been how negative a lot of progressives, especially younger progressives, are about his presidency and what he's done. If you look at the pieces of law that Biden has managed to get put in a 50-50 Senate, when he's also had to navigate people like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who some days seem to exist only to thwart progressive policy ambitions, it's a real achievement. And I think that Warren, Sanders, and Ocasio-Cortez all recognize that because rather than be kind of bomb-throwing outsiders, which all three of these characters were at different points in their career. They were activists more than politicians. They've recognized that Biden has this superpower that they can exploit to get their policies put into law. And that superpower is that he seems like a boring, normie, centrist old guy who doesn't frighten the likes of Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema or anybody else. Biden doesn't code as a radical because for his entire career, he's been known as a pro-business Democrat. And so he's been able to get a lot of things enacted, everything, student loan forgiveness. We talked about the climate stuff, the multiple rounds of stimulus, everything that he did after the economy crashed, after COVID, from loan freezes to eviction moratoriums to small business loans, all of it focused on the middle class, very little of it focused on Wall Street. I think the fact that neither Warren, Bernie, nor AOC decided to challenge him in 2024 is a reflection of the fact that they recognize that he's out there carrying his agenda, even if the kind of broader swaths of the progressive left don't view him that way and are still very anti-Biden.
I think it's two superpowers, Josh. It's number one, that he's perceived as being a moderate, like we're talking about, but it's also that he's the master of the Senate. He spent decades in the Senate. He knows how the Senate works. He has these relationships with senators, and Warren and Sanders are in the Senate as well and have been for periods of time, but they've never really shown that they can move senators in their direction on policy. I don't think Sanders had authored any bills that became law. He authored amendments that became law, but he was not exactly particularly skilled at navigating the dynamics of the Senate. And Biden is the king of the Senate.
That's absolutely right. I would go a few steps further and say that, Joe Biden as president has accomplished much more for the progressive left than a President Warren or a President Sanders could have. We've seen that while Warren and Sanders can each draw large bodies of support among Democrats, their appeal is definitely circumscribed and limited. They're not just Republicans who dislike them, but centrist Democrats like Sinema, like Joe Manchin. And so it's impossible for me to believe that like a President Sanders could have passed the Inflation Reduction Act with all the progressive goodies buried under that label, or Warren, simply because somebody like Joe Manchin would have felt it necessary to stand up and oppose anything that a quote unquote radical left president got behind. And look, I think all three of my main characters at the end of the day are very, very good politicians, skilled legislators. They understand how Washington works, unlike Bernie Sanders early in his career, who wanted to be a purist, was basically a messaging candidate, and as you said, had no track record at all of getting his policies put into law. All three of these characters have kind of morphed into very effective legislators. So these are not like left-wing versions of Matt Gaetz, the right-wing Republican character who's just out there creating chaos for the sake of getting attention and getting on TV. And I think that's part of the broader success of the populist left that I tell in this book. It really didn't exist in the 1990s and 2000s. There really wasn't this wing of the party. And it took the financial crisis and all the pain and austerity after that to give rise to this movement, which has since very much changed what the Democratic Party stands for. Not just folks on the left like the members of the Squad, but also the most mainstream Democrat of all, Joe Biden.
So, Josh, you've described how the three main characters have adopted a little bit more of a pragmatic streak and how they've approached legislation. I think in particular for the two older ones, Warren and Sanders, they might realize that their time to run for president has passed. They're both quite old, still not quite as old as the incumbent, but there might not be enough cycles left where they would take a shot at it. Is the pragmatism that you're describing partly because they have given up on that ambition and decided to really put their heads down and focus on legislative work, not to politics outside of Congress?
Yeah, I don't think it really has to do with their presidential ambitions. I mean, you could see that in Bernie Sanders after 2016. There was a split in the Democratic Party between Sanders voters and Clinton voters and a lot of animosity. And if you fast forward to 2019, 2020, there was no such animosity between Sanders and Joe Biden. They came together immediately. Sanders, Warren, and AOC all had a lot of influence with the transition, with the administration staffing. I think they really cared about their policies, and I think they're all good enough politicians that they understood that they wielded a lot of influence, and that the way to exploit that influence and to get real gains was to push the policies and in a lot of cases the personnel that they wanted into the Biden administration, understanding that he was capable of moving this stuff forward in a way that would change the country for the better and change a lot of people's lives. And so I weirdly just ran into somebody today whose student debt had been canceled and was all excited. And that's the sort of thing that would not happen, I think, if Biden were left to his own devices. That became an issue because Elizabeth Warren pushed that issue hard, convinced Biden he had to do it. He did it. The Supreme Court blocked the way he wanted to do it, and he's since found smaller other ways to do it. But the point is, all three of them are having an effect. And like really, if you're in politics as an elected official, that ought to be the goal. I mean, we see more and more people who kind of do it, I think, to boost their social media followings or because they want to be influencers or whatever. But all three of my characters are serious politicians, and they've understood and managed to figure out how to advance their goals through the Biden administration, whether or not they run for president. Don't see that happening with Bernie or Warren, but with AOC, she turns 35 in October of this year, so her presidential window is just about to open.
So she's the one that we've talked about the least so far, but she is the one that's got the longest career ahead of her just on account of her youth. And you've put her already on the cover next to two U.S. senators who have run for president, who are, we all recognize, major figures in American politics and American life. So quite a sort of feather in her cap there. We're talking about how Sanders and Warren recognize that they can have a lot of influence inside of the Biden administration, which is going to go at least another year, maybe much longer. But for Ocasio, the window is so much larger than that. Where do you think she sees her career going? Does she expect that she will run for president, or does she have any other idea about what she hopes to achieve in the next, if she follows the same trajectory as Biden, Sanders, and Warren, maybe 50 years of public life?
It's a great question, and I don't think anybody knows the answer yet. I'm not sure she does either. The thing about Ocasio-Cortez is that as good a politician as she is at getting her policies enacted, and I mean, to me, the real evidence of that is how she's pushed Biden on climate and gotten so much, not a full Green New Deal, as her critics would point out, but a big piece of one. I still think she's viewed as too radical within the Democratic Party to, at this point in her career, say, run for president and capture the Democratic nomination. But she could certainly run, let's say, in 2028. There's going to be a big field of Democrats. I expect Bernie Sanders will be retired by then. She could certainly run as a kind of Bernie Sanders style factional left candidate and certainly enhance her profile, force her issues into the Democratic debate, and probably influence what other candidates stand for, including the eventual nominee. Or she may decide to run for statewide office, either as senator or governor. Still think that'd be a little tough in New York, but she's a good politician, so I wouldn't want to say it's impossible. Or she may decide to drop out entirely and become some sort of media figure. I mean, I feel like especially after Trump, there are more paths to influence in political high office today than there were 10 or 20 years ago. And, maybe she decides that that's the way to go.
Her base of support is understood to be young Gen Z progressives. And some recent trends have had me wondering about the extent and the depth of the commitment among that cohort to actual substantive economic populism. There's been some notice that many in this cohort, self-described socialist progressives in the Gen Z on social media, have taken to complaining about fast food prices and by extension about the wages that blue-collar workers, including fast food workers, are earning. This has been the subject of think pieces from Eric Levitz and other writers. And I do wonder, with that in mind, whether the Gen Z, self-described socialist leftists are really fully committed to the actual policy agenda of Ocasio and others. Whether maybe there is a bit of an aesthetic component here and the actual interest in seeing low wage workers see a pay bump is maybe skin deep. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're onto something. And I kind of write about this a little bit in the book about Ocasio-Cortez's evolution from, an activist who literally occupied Nancy Pelosi's office with Sunrise Movement activists before she was even sworn into Congress. The journey that she's traveled from that person to being the person who cooperates with Biden in order to advance an agenda, that created some blowback. And I write about in the book about how, there was a big push a few years ago among left activists to force a Medicare for all bill onto the floor of the House. And Ocasio-Cortez was against it and got into kind of a social media fight with one of her followers. He said, why won't you do this? And she says, well, because it doesn't have the votes. And to, put it on the floor and fail, it wouldn't pressure people in the way that you're imagining. It would just mean the bill would lose, and it would show that we're weak and we don't have the coalition. What we need to do instead is the hard, unglamorous, not social media friendly work of painstakingly building a Washington coalition to get behind a Medicare for all bill. And that's the truth about actually making advances in politics. Is it's not driven by who has the biggest dunk on Twitter or who makes the most viral TikTok video. Those things really don't matter much at all. What matters, and Ocasio-Cortez discovered this and adapted, was being able to put together a winning coalition and being able to use your influence in ways that allow you to get what you want. And that's part of the art of politics that doesn't really translate into tweets or 30-second TikTok videos. And so I do have my doubts about whether the kind of Gen Z socialist social media folks are really there to kind of do the hard work in politics, or whether it's kind of virtue signaling and that sort of thing.
Jeremy Corbyn will not stand for Labour at the next general election as a Labour Party candidate. What I said about the party changing, I meant, and we are not going back, and that is why Jeremy Corbyn will not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election.
Josh, another reason that I'm kind of wondering about the future of economic populism on the left is looking at trends abroad. So often the trends that we see here are preceded by canaries in the coal mine elsewhere. A lot of people have pointed to the Brexit vote in the summer of 2016 as a signal that Trump's election was on the horizon. We can also look at events that are happening abroad and see signs of trouble for populism. So, for example, Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. He had a crushing election defeat in 2019, and the Labour Party in the UK have replaced him with Keir Starmer, who's running as the heir to Tony Blair, a return to third way, centrist, sort of neoliberal center-left politics. And it's working. He's now at 49% in recent polls, with the Tories, his main opposition, at only 20%. It shows that there is perhaps a lot of currency left for this kind of politics. We can also look to Germany, where in the recent election, Olaf Scholz of the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, he ran explicitly as a candidate of continuity with the conservative government that preceded him that he was part of. And he brought the Socialist Party to power for the first time in 16 years, to the chancellorship. We can also look at France, where Emmanuel Macron, who was a member of the Socialist Party, left the Socialist Party, started a new party that most voters in France consider to be a center-right party. And it got him elected to the presidency twice. And he's now aligning his party with the sort of neoliberal center-right cohort inside the European Parliament. So at the same time as we are tempted to look at economic populism as the future, looking at the trend in the Democratic Party that Biden has taken policy since the 2020 election, we can also look and see that perhaps the wave has crested in so many other instances. And in fact, there's sort of a backlash to it and a move among center-left parties back towards the neoliberal consensus of the previous era.
Yeah, I mean, you could start that backlash if you wanted to in the 2020 Democratic primaries, where you had two left populist choices in Bernie and Sanders, and Democratic voters ultimately chose Joe Biden. But I don't think that a return to the neoliberal consensus is in the offing. I mean, certainly not in America. And I do think that populism has a lot more force in the U.S. these days in American politics still. Call it American exceptionalism if you want. But it has a lot of rhetorical power both on the left and on the right. I think personally that in part because of the inability of these pure populists like Warren, like Sanders, Corbyn for more than a time to really capture an enduring majority, that the path forward for this brand of populism is going to be through a more moderate candidate, call it the Joe Biden model if you want. It may well be that Ocasio-Cortez decides to run in 2028 as the pure candidate. And if so, we'll get a good test of that. But I think the likelier path is that a Democrat with a broader appeal across the party, someone like, for instance, Raphael Warnock in Georgia or Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, will recognize the potency of these issues and kind of take them up under their own umbrella and carry them forward that way. And I think both of those are probably more electable, likelier to win the nomination than someone like an Ocasio-Cortez would be in 2028. But we'll have to wait and see.
I suppose it's sort of like a moderate Trojan horse for economic populism in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I would also say that, more and more, you don't even have to hide it. Like there doesn't have to be that kind of subterfuge. We have Joe Biden, as we said earlier, he's come out and proposed a billionaire's tax. A couple months ago, he was out on a UAW picket line. So it's not as if these ideas taken in isolation are unpopular. Quite the opposite. When you see things like a minimum wage ballot or even a wealth tax, like on a state ballot referendum, divorced from individual politicians, they tend to be like pretty popular. And so I think politicians like Biden realize that, oh, hey, I can go out and walk on a union picket line. I can be explicitly pro-labor, and that won't help me. And in fact, it'll actually help me. It won't hurt me. And so, if you look at where, Biden stands vis-a-vis labor, if you look at the kind of renewal of the American labor movement over the last 15 years, I wouldn't attribute a lot of that to Biden. But the fact that is now a safe space for a Democratic president, a centrist, somebody who was a senator from Delaware, which is sort of the most pro-corporate state in the country, the fact that he feels comfortable and he thinks it's politically advantageous to go out and walk on a UAW picket line, I think shows the political potency of a lot of these policies in being able to attract not just Democratic voters, but independents and even some Republicans.
So, Josh, as we're wrapping up here, I think my last question to you is going to be about this election on the horizon right now. So I think that we've kind of described how Biden is maybe almost a mirror image of Obama in the sense that he's perceived as a moderate, although he's pursuing these economically populist, more left-wing policies. And Obama, on the other hand, ran sort of as an economic populist in the way that we described earlier, while actually being quite a good friend to Wall Street and in particular to the tech industry. So I want to know if you think the industries have noticed this, how they're adjusting, and how they are going to approach the next election cycle and whether that's going to have an impact on the race. I'm thinking in particular of the tech industry, which was very fond of Obama and kind of an ally of the Democratic Party in that era and has a major influence on political communication. Have they turned on the Democratic Party because of the anti-corporate populist turn that Biden has taken? And how might that shape the way that the next election plays out?
Yeah, I think parts of it absolutely have. And on that, you raise another interesting point, Biden's antitrust agenda, which is broken with years of kind of pro-corporate policy. And now he's put in place people like Lena Khan, very aggressive Justice Department that's gone after breaking up mergers between big companies. And that has enraged a lot of folks in Silicon Valley, whether it's people like Elon Musk and his ilk, or even people kind of less extreme who've taken kind of a right-wing anti-Biden turn. Folks like Mark Andreessen, who's come out recently criticizing a lot of what Democrats stand for. I do think it's had an effect, yeah. But there's still a lot of socially liberal folks in Silicon Valley who support Democrats. A lot of the money flowing into the Democratic Party still comes from kind of rank and file tech workers. If you look at FEC reports, that kind of thing. But I do think that it has come at a cost. I mean, if you go back to Barack Obama in 2008, everybody in Silicon Valley loved him. They thought of him almost as a startup and showered him with money in a way that allowed him to win the nomination. There is certainly no longer that kind of unanimity in the tech space. And I think that's one reason why you see people like Elon Musk inviting folks like Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy, kind of right-wing provocateurs, onto Twitter, onto X, onto their spaces to kind of go out and tout their brand of politics, because left populism is not something that's particularly popular among Silicon Valley tech folks.
All right, Josh, this has been a fascinating discussion. I'm so glad that we had a chance to have it. Just like I said, there's been so much focus on the populists on the right. Let's take a further look at populists on the left. And that's what people can do if they read The Rebels.
Thanks so much for having me. Enjoyed it.